They told us the chapel would come down on a Tuesday, and that we had until the Tuesday before to clear it of everything but the stone. I am the one who asked for the last watch. I want that on the record, because in the weeks afterward a great many people claimed the idea as theirs, and I let them, the way you let a man take credit for a thing if it costs you nothing and means something to him. But it was mine. I stood in the empty nave of the Regimental Chapel of St. Brand the Steadfast on a gray afternoon in the last week of its life, and I looked at the names cut into the walls, and I said to the man beside me, "Someone should stand the watch one more time, before they take it from the rolls." The man beside me was Sergeant Eames, and he did not answer at once. He had 30 years in the Crown's foot guard against my 19, and he had buried more friends out of that chapel than I had known. He looked along the wall where the names ran in their close gray columns, regiment by regiment, year by year, and then he said the only thing that mattered. "Who would you put on it?" "Me," I said, "if you'll let me." That is how it began, and I will tell it plainly, because there was nothing in it that was loud. Our trade is not loud. We are the men who stand still in the red tunic and the tall black bearskin while the world walks past us taking pictures, and the whole of our craft is in the not moving, in the holding of a thing so steady that strangers think we are not men at all. People imagine the discipline is the hard part. It is not. The hard part is the meaning underneath the discipline, the reason you hold, and most days nobody asks you for it. That week, for once, somebody did. The chapel asked. You have to understand what the chapel was, or none of the rest will weigh anything. It was not grand. There are cathedrals in the capital that would swallow it whole and not notice. St. Brand's was a low, square-towered building of dark stone at the edge of the old barrack ground, with a slate roof that leaked at the north corner and a single bell that we rang ourselves because the rope had never been fitted for a sexton. For 300 years it had belonged to the regiment and to no one else. When a guardsman fell in a far war, in a near accident, in the slow surrender of old age in a cot by a window, his name was cut into the wall of St. Brand's by a mason who came up from the town and worked with his sleeves rolled and said almost nothing. The walls were nearly full. That was part of why they were closing it. The other part was money, and a survey that called the tower unsafe, and a decision made in a room by men who had never stood a watch in their lives. I will not pretend I understood their reasons. I only understood that the names were going to be left in an empty building, and then the building was going to be unmade, deconsecrated by a short service and a signature, and the ground sold, and that somewhere in all of that a thing was owed and nobody had thought to pay it. So I asked to pay it, one watch, the night before the deconsecration, full kit, the post at the head of the nave, the names at my back, and the altar before me from the last light of the evening to the first gray of the morning. Eames took it to the major, and the major took it higher, and word came back down through the proper channels the way word does, slowly and then all at once. Permission granted. One man. One night. No press. No fuss. I should have known it would not stay that small. Nothing that touches the heart of soldiers ever does. The afternoon I came up to make ready, the chapel was already half stripped. The hangings were down. The brass had gone to be polished and stored. 2 men from the works department were lifting the kneelers and stacking them by the door, and a young chaplain I did not know was moving along the aisle with a clipboard, ticking off items against a list. The candlesticks, the lectern, the small silver cross that had stood on the altar since before any name on the wall was cut. He was a careful young man, and he was doing his job, and I disliked him on sight for it, which was unfair, and which I corrected in myself before the night was out. He looked up when my boots sounded on the stone. He saw the kit bag on my shoulder and the bearskin in its case under my arm, and his face changed. "You're the one standing the vigil," he said. "I am." "I wasn't told it would be." He stopped and started again. "I wasn't told the dress would be full ceremonial. I thought it would be, you know, a private thing, a man sitting quietly." "It's a watch," I said, "not a wake." He did not understand the difference. Most people don't, and I did not have the words for it then, standing in the dust of the half-emptied nave with a stranger's clipboard between us. A wake is for grief. A watch is for duty. You sit at a wake, you stand a watch. I had not asked to come and be sad in the chapel. I had asked to come and guard it, one last time, the way the men whose names were on the wall had guarded things that mattered, all the way down the long gray columns, so that the building would not pass out of the regiment's keeping unattended, like a thing nobody loved. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of my trade, and I could not explain it to him, so I only set down my bag at the foot of the chancel step and began to make ready. The young chaplain, his name was Father Wren, I learned later, and I came to think well of him, stood watching me for a moment, and then did a thing I did not expect. He set down his clipboard. He went to the wall to the nearest column of names, and he read a few of them in a low voice, the way you read a thing to find out whether it is real. Then he said, without turning around, "How many?" "On the walls." "Yes." 4,109, I said. "The last one was cut in the spring, a drummer. He was 91. He'd outlived everyone who could remember him drumming." Father Wren was quiet for a while. "And tomorrow we close it," he said. It was not quite a question. It was a man hearing the weight of his own list for the first time. "Tomorrow you close it," I agreed. "Tonight I'll stand the watch." He nodded slowly and picked his clipboard back up, but I noticed he did not tick off the silver cross. He left it on the altar. He left it for me. I understood then that he was not my enemy and never had been, only a young man given a hard duty by men who would not have to feel it, the same as me. The works party finished at 5. The light through the high windows had gone from gray to the color of old pewter, and the chapel had emptied of its noise, the way a room does when the last person who was talking goes out and shuts the door. I stood in the center of the nave in the deepening quiet, and I dressed for the watch: tunic, belt, the white gloves, the bearskin settled and squared, the chin strap firm. And when I was ready, I took my place at the head of the nave with the altar before me and the 4,000 names behind me, and the great silence came down over the whole of it like snow. Then I heard the door open again at the back of the chapel, and I knew, before I heard the footsteps, that the night was not going to be mine alone. It was Eames. He came up the aisle out of uniform in a plain dark coat, an old soldier in a sweater visiting a place he had loved, and he carried a folding camp stool under one arm. He did not speak. He set the stool down against the side wall, well off my post, in the place where a watching man sits so as not to break the watch he is honoring, and he lowered himself onto it with the small grunt of a knee that has knelt in too many wet trenches, and he folded his hands and looked at the altar. He had told me when I asked that he would not come. He had said it would be too much, and here he was, because of course he was. You do not bury 30 years of friends out of a building and then let it die alone with a stranger, however good the stranger's intentions. He had come to keep the watch over the man keeping the watch. That is a thing soldiers do. There is no order for it. It is older than orders. For a long while neither of us made a sound. The light failed by degrees. The names on the walls went from gray to charcoal to shapes you knew were there but could no longer read. And then the works party's last man came back to leave us 2 storm lanterns, because the chapel's power had been cut that afternoon, and lit them, and went out again with a nod that was almost a salute. The lanterns threw a low gold light up the lower courses of stone, and in that light the nearest names came back out of the dark, and I stood among them. I want to tell you what a watch is from the inside, because the world only ever sees the outside. The world sees a man not moving and thinks the work is in the stillness of the body. It is not. The body learns that in the first year. The body is easy. The work is in the stillness of the mind, in standing for hours with nothing to hold you up but the reason you came, and not letting that reason slip. A weak reason will not hold a man through a single hour. He will start to shift, to invent itches, to count the minutes, to wish himself away. A true reason will hold him through a whole night and leave him standing taller at the dawn than he was at the dusk. I had stood many watches in 19 years, on cold gates and hot parades, and once through a night when a storm took half the roof off the guardhouse, and we held the line anyway because the king was sleeping behind us and did not need to wake to find his guard gone. But I had never stood one like this. The thing behind me was not a sleeping king. It was 4,109 men who could not stand for themselves any longer and had asked nothing of me and would never know. That is the purest watch there is, the one no one you are guarding can ever thank you for. I found in the first hour that it held me easily. The reason did not slip. If anything, it grew. Somewhere in the second hour, Eames spoke for the first time. He did not look at me. You do not break a man's watch by making him answer. He spoke to the altar and to the names and to the dark. "My brother's up there," he said. "Top of the third column, west wall, cut high because they were filling from the top that year. Davin Eames. He went out before I joined. I never knew him. My mother used to bring me here when I was a boy and lift me up so I could put my hand on his name and tell me, 'That's your brother, that's where the regiment keeps him.' I didn't understand. I thought she meant he lived in the wall." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh and was not quite. "I'm 61 years old, and I still can't walk past that wall without putting my hand up to the third column. Tomorrow they'll lock the door, and I won't be able to reach him." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than what he had said. But I turned my eyes, only my eyes, the head does not move on watch, to the west wall, and found the third column, and held the place in my sight where a boy had once been lifted to touch his brother's name. And I understood, standing there, that this was the thing the men in the room with the survey had not been able to see. They had seen a building. They had not seen that the building was the only address 4,000 families had for their dead. You cannot survey that. It does not show up as load-bearing, but it bears more than any wall in the kingdom. The night deepened. The cold came up out of the stone floor the way it always does in old churches, through the boots first, then the knees, then settling into the spine, and I let it come and did not fight it because fighting cold wastes the heat you have. Outside, the barrack ground was silent. The town beyond it had gone to bed. Once far off, a dog barked twice and stopped. The 2 lanterns burned steady. Eames sat with his hands folded. I stood my post, and the names waited. I did not expect the others. That is the part I still cannot fully explain. We had let it be known to no one, no press, the major had said, and we had kept to it. I had not told a soul beyond Eames, and Eames had told no one. And yet a little before midnight the door opened a third time, and a fourth, and then it simply stayed open, and they came in. They came in ones and twos, quietly, the way men come into a church when they are not sure they are allowed. Old men, most of them, in plain coats with regimental ties knotted at their throats, some with canes, one in a wheelchair pushed by a younger man who had his father's jaw. A woman in a gray coat with a folded flag held against her chest, the way you hold a sleeping infant. 2 serving guardsmen, off duty in civilian clothes, who came in and saw me at my post and stopped dead in the aisle and then, very deliberately, took off their hats. They had heard. I never learned exactly how. A word from a work-sparty man to a brother to an old comrade, the old comrade to the rest. The way word travels through a regiment along channels no command ever mapped. By midnight there were perhaps 40 people in the nave of a chapel that the world had finished with, sitting in the pews that were left or standing along the walls with their hands on the names, and not one of them said a word above a whisper, and not one of them asked me to stand down, and not one of them came past the chancel step where my post was. They left me my watch. They had come to keep it with me. I will tell you what that did to a man trained for 19 years to feel nothing on his face. It did not break me. The discipline held. The discipline always holds, or it is not discipline. But behind the discipline something rose that I had not felt so strongly in all my years in the red tunic, a thing I can only call the weight of being right. We had thought we were stealing one quiet night for a building nobody else cared about. And here, in the lantern light, was the proof that we had been wrong about the nobody. They cared. They had cared all along. They had only been waiting, the way I had been waiting, for someone to say that someone should stand the watch one more time. A little after 1 in the morning, an old man worked his way up the aisle on 2 canes, slow as the tide, and stopped before me. He was very old, older than Eames by a decade at least, and he wore a row of faded ribbons on a coat that had been pressed for the occasion by hands that shook. He looked up at me from under white brows, and I looked as a man on watch looks at the air over his head. And he said, in a voice like dry paper, the thing that turned the whole night. "Will you read them?" he said. I did not understand at first, and a watch does not let you ask. He saw the not understanding in the only place it could show, which was nowhere, and he understood it anyway, the way the very old understand the young. "The names, son," he said, "all of them, out loud. So the last sound in this place is their names and not the locksmith's drill. My boy is up there. 40 years he's been up there, and I've come every year on the day, and every year I read him out loud, and the year I can't come will be the year I'm in the ground. Tomorrow there's no more coming." His hands tightened on the canes. "Somebody ought to say all of them, once, out loud, before the door shuts. I can't do it, I can't stand long enough. But you," and here he looked for the first time not at the air over my head but straight into my eyes, breaking the watch's small unwritten courtesy because what he had to say outranked it, "you can stand. God knows you can stand. So will you read them?" Now I have to explain a thing about a guard on watch, and I will be honest about it, because the whole turn of this night sits on it. A guard on a ceremonial watch does not speak. It is not a guideline, it is the spine of the thing. The silence is the discipline made audible, or rather made inaudible, and a man who breaks it without cause has broken his watch as surely as if he had walked off his post. In 19 years I had never spoken on watch. I had been shouted at, mocked, photographed, jostled, and once spat near, and I had not spoken. The silence was not a rule I obeyed. It was a thing I was. And here was an old man asking me to break it. Not for a prank. Not because he was arrogant or wanted to make me move for a camera. He was asking me to break the smaller silence in order to keep the larger one, to spend my discipline, all of it, on the only payment the night could make to 4,000 men who would otherwise pass into the dark unsaid. He was asking me to understand that the watch was never the point. The watch was only ever the way you carried the meaning, and the meaning, tonight, was the names. I looked over his head at the altar, at the small silver cross the young chaplain had left for me, and I made the decision that I will answer for to the end of my life and not regret. I did not break my post. I did not move from the head of the nave. I stood exactly where a guard stands, kit squared, eyes forward, the bearskin not a degree out of true, but I let the silence go. I opened my mouth, in that cold gold-lit chapel, before 40 strangers and a sergeant on a camp stool and an old man on 2 canes, and I began to read the names of the dead. I started at the top of the first column, east wall, which is the oldest, where the stone is worn nearly smooth and the cuts are deep and serifed in the old style. The first name on the wall is a man called Osric Hale, fallen in a year so long ago it means nothing now, and I read him out into the silence, the first words I had ever spoken on a watch. Osric Hale. My voice did not shake. I had thought it might. It came out level and carrying, a guardsman's voice, the voice you used to give an order across a parade ground, and it filled the chapel and went up into the dark roof and came back down, and somewhere in the pews a woman drew a breath. "Daved Orme," I read, "Cuthwin Lacey, Brand Aldous, Whiston Row," column by column, year by year, down the long gray rolls. I did not hurry. You do not hurry the dead. I gave each man the same weight, the rich man's son and the foundling, the general and the drummer, the man who fell at the head of a charge and the man who died in a cot at 91, having outlived everyone who could remember him. On the wall they are equal. That is the chapel's last and best lesson, and the one the survey could not read. In the wall there is no rank. There is only the name, and the regiment's promise that the name will be kept. I had been reading perhaps a quarter of an hour when I understood the chapel had begun to answer me. It started with the old man on the canes. When I reached his son's name, it was in the fourth column of the south wall, and I did not know it was his until I read it, Thomas Marsh. And behind me I heard a single sob that was more like a man setting down a great weight than weeping. When I read it, the old man said very quietly, "There he is." And then he said to the room, "That's my boy." And nobody told him to be quiet because he was not breaking the silence, he was completing it. After that they all began to do it. As I read down the walls, when I came to a name that belonged to someone in the room, that someone would answer, not loudly, just a word, acclaiming, the oldest answer there is. Here, "That's my father, my husband. That's Refford, we played together as boys." The woman in the gray coat with the flag against her chest waited through 200 names with her eyes closed, and when I read Aldi's Caro, she opened them and said, "Thank you," not to me, to the wall, and pressed the flag tighter, and I understood that Aldi's Caro had been hers, and that she had not had a place to say his name aloud and be answered in a long time, and now she did, one last time before the place was taken away. I read for hours. I will not pretend I remember all of it. A watch goes somewhere outside of time, and a watch with 4,000 names on it goes very far out indeed. The lanterns burned low, and a works-party man slipped in and refilled them and slipped out. The cold settled all the way into the bone, and I kept reading. My voice held. I had wondered, going in, whether a man's voice could last 4,000 names, and I learned that it can if the reason behind it is true, because the voice is only the body and the body is easy. It was never the body that did the standing. Eames rose from his camp stool at some point and came to stand at my shoulder, off the post, just behind, and when my throat began at last to fail him, he did a thing we had not arranged. He picked up the reading. When I had read a column dry and my voice cracked, he took the next, in his old sergeant's growl, and gave me a column to rest, and then I took it back, and so we passed the rolls between us like men passing a heavy thing hand to hand so that none of them carries it alone. That, too, is a watch. It is the oldest meaning of the word. You spell each other so the line is never unheld. Toward the dead middle of the night, when we had read the east wall and the south wall entire and were partway up the west, I reached the third column, cut high, from the year they filled from the top down. And I knew what was coming, and I read up the column toward it the way you walk the last yards toward a grave, and Eames went very still at my shoulder, and I read, "Davin Eames." For a moment the sergeant beside me did not breathe. Then he did the thing his mother had done for him 60 years before, except there was no one to lift him now and he needed no lifting. He was a grown man and an old soldier, and he simply reached up in his plain dark coat and laid his bare hand flat against his brother's name on the cold stone, the name of a brother he had never met and had loved his whole life, and he said, in a voice that did not break because 30 years of discipline would not let it, "Here. He's here. I've got him." And then quieter only to the wall, "I came, Davin. I came one more time." I gave him a moment. The chapel gave him a moment. Then I read the next name because the watch goes on, and the next, and the next, and Eames took his hand from the stone and squared his shoulders and read with me again, and we carried it on together toward the dawn. Around 3 in the morning the door opened once more, and a man came in whom the room did not expect, and the temperature of the night changed. It was the major, not in plain clothes, in uniform, his greatcoat over it against the cold, and behind him 2 officers I half knew and a man in a civilian suit I did not know at all, who had the careful, sleepless look of someone who has driven a long way to deal with a problem. The whisper of names faltered. Old men who had spent their lives in the regiment came half to their feet out of long habit, the way you rise when the brass walks in, and the major lifted a hand and said, "Lo, as you were, please, as you were," and they settled back uncertain. I did not stop reading. I was in the middle of a column, and you do not abandon a column of the dead because rank has entered the room, and so I read on Edric Vane, Holt Carver, Sefton Lyle and the major came up the aisle through the lantern light and stopped a little short of my post, and listened, and the civilian in the suit stopped beside him with a thin folder under his arm and a face that did not know what it had walked into. When I finished the column, I let a silence fall, and into it the major spoke. "Sergeant Eames," he said. "Corporal." He used my rank and not my name, which told me this was official, and my stomach went cold in a way the chapel's stone had not managed all night. "I'm told there's a vigil. I authorized a vigil. 1 man, 1 night, no fuss. I didn't authorize." He looked along the pews, at the 40 faces, at the woman with the flag, at the old man on his 2 canes who had asked me to read, and whatever he had meant to say, he did not say it. He started again. "What is this?" It was Eames who answered, because Eames outranked me in years if not in nothing else, and because his hand had been on his brother's name not an hour before. "Sir," he said, "the corporal's reading the names, all of them, out loud, before the door shuts for good." He paused. "We didn't put out the words, sir. They came on their own. I'd stake my pension on it." The major was quiet. He was not a soft man. You do not rise in the foot guard by being soft, and I had seen him take the skin off a slack platoon without raising his voice. But he was a regimental man to the marrow, and he turned and looked at the east wall where I had begun, 4 hours and 2,000 names ago, and I watched a thing happen to his face that I had not thought to see there. He read a few of the names to himself, his lips moving, and then he found one, I do not know which. He never said, and he stood looking at it for a long moment with the whole night gone silent around him. Then the civilian in the suit cleared his throat. "Major," he said, in the low, reasonable voice of a man who has come to be reasonable at people, "I appreciate the sentiment, I do. But the deconsecration is at 10. The contractors are on site at 8. I have a schedule signed off 3 levels above us, and a building that the structural survey has condemned, and I cannot have," he gestured, not unkindly, at the room, 40 members of the public in a condemned structure overnight. "The liability alone. I'm going to have to ask you to clear the chapel." And there it was, the thing the whole night had been walking toward without my knowing it. Not a provoker, not a thug, not a man who wanted to make a guard flinch for a camera, only a tired official with a folder and a schedule and 3 levels of signatures above him, doing like the young chaplain, a hard job given to him by men who would not have to feel it. He was not cruel. That was almost the worst of it. He was simply right in the small way that schedules are right, and entirely blind to the larger way in which he was about to do something that could never be undone. The room held its breath. The 2 serving guardsmen near the door straightened. The old man on the canes looked at me, only at me, and I saw the fear in him, not of the official, but that the names would stop, that Tomas Marsh and Davin Eames and 4,000 others would be the locksmiths tomorrow, and not the regiments tonight, that the watch would be cleared an hour before its work was done. I felt the whole weight of it come to rest on the head of the knave where I stood, on the one man in the room whose entire trade was the holding of a line that the world wanted him to break. So I held it. I did the only thing 19 years had made me for. I did not argue with the official. It was not my place, and arguing was not my craft. My craft was the line. I did not stop reading either, which was the line. I drew a breath, and into the held silence of that condemned chapel, I read the next name on the wall. "Brand Eames," I said, "a cousin of the sergeant's, 3 lines down from his brother, clear and level and carrying, the way you read a thing that will not be hurried by any schedule signed at any height. And then the next, Refford Stone, and the next." The official turned to me and his reasonable face tightened. "Corporal," he said, "I asked the major to clear the chapel. That includes the vigil." I did not look at him. A guard on watch does not look at the man who tells him to step off his post. That is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you forget. I looked at the wall, and I read the next name. Aldous Penn. "Corporal, sharper now. I'm giving you a lawful instruction." And here the major spoke, and I have carried what he said for the rest of my life. He did not raise his voice. He stepped between the official and my post, not aggressively, just placing himself there, the way an officer places himself between his men and a thing coming at them, and he said, "No. You gave me an instruction, and I'm the senior officer present, and I'm telling you the vigil stands until it's finished. You can clear the public if you judge the building unsafe. That's your call, and I won't fight you on the law. But that man is on a watch authorized by this regiment, and you do not, sir, order a guard off the names of his own dead. Not tonight. Not in this building. Not while I'm standing in it." He let that sit. Then quieter, and this is the part I carry. He'll finish reading them, everyone. If it takes till noon and the contractors have to wait, they'll wait. Some things you delay a schedule for. This is one of them. The official looked at the major, and at the wall, and at the old man on the two canes, and at me reading on in the lantern light as if no schedule in the world could touch me, because in that moment none could. And something in him gave way. Not in fear. The major had not frightened him, and I think if he had only been frightened he would have dug in. It gave way because he was, underneath the folder and the schedule, a man, and a man cannot stand in a room where 4,000 names are being read aloud over their families, and go on believing that his 8 o'clock is the most important thing in it. He looked down at the thin folder under his arm. Then he opened it, and took out a pen, and I thought for one ugly second he was going to make us sign something. Instead, he turned to a blank page at the back, and he said, in a different voice altogether, a voice with the reasonableness gone out of it and something younger underneath, "What was the name? The one you just read. I want to write it down." "Aldous Penn," I told him, not stopping my watch, only answering. He wrote it, and then he said, "Read on, Corporal. I'll move the contractors to noon. I'll deal with the schedule." He capped the pen. "And I'd be obliged," he said, very low, looking at the floor, "if you'd let me stay and hear the rest." So he stayed. The official who had come to clear the chapel sat down in a pew at the back with his folder on his knees, and somewhere in the last 1,000 names I heard him answer one, only one, quietly. "Yes," the way the others had answered theirs. And I never asked, and he never said whose it was, but he had come into that room with a schedule and no dead in it, and he did not leave it that way. Nobody in that chapel left it the way they came in. The gray came at last. It came the way it always comes to a man at the end of a watch, not as an event but as a slow admission, the high windows going from black to charcoal to the color of pewter, the lanterns suddenly looking small and yellow against it, the cold at its very worst in the last hour as it always is. And I read the last column of the last wall, Eames at my shoulder taking every third name to spell my failing voice, the room full and silent behind us, and I came at the very end to the newest cut in all that ancient stone, low on the north wall where the mason had started a fresh column that would now never be filled. The drummer, 91 years old, dead in the spring, outliving everyone who could remember him drumming. Hesper Vale, I read, the last name on the wall. The 4,109th. And I let it ring out and up into the roof and come back down, and then I did the thing a watch ends on, the only thing left to do. I came to attention, full attention, the heels together, the rifle correct in a chapel that the world had condemned, and that 40 people had refused to let die unwatched, and I gave the names the salute you give the fallen, slow, the white glove rising, holding, coming down. And behind me, the whole room got to its feet, the old men on their canes and the woman with her flag and the 2 off-duty guardsmen and the major and the official with his folder. And they did not clap, because you do not clap, and they did not speak, and the silence that came down then was not the empty silence I had walked into at 5 o'clock the evening before. It was a full one. It was the silence of a thing finished right. We did not deconsecrate the chapel at 10. We did it at noon, after the contractors had waited and the dawn had warmed the stone, and the short service was read by Father Wren, who had heard from the works party what had happened in the night and had asked, before he began, whether he might add a line that was not in the order of service. He read the line at the end. He said, 4,109 names were kept in this place, and on the last night they were each one spoken aloud and answered. The building closes. The keeping does not. Then he took up the small silver cross he had left on the altar for me, and the door was locked, and that was the end of Saint Brand the Steadfast. But it was not the end of the names. That is the thing I most want you to understand, the thing the survey could never have measured and the schedule could not undo. The official with the folder kept his blank page. He had written down every name I read while he sat there, and it turned out he was a methodical man, the way men with folders are, and within the year, quietly, on his own time, with no order from above and no fuss, the way our trade does the things that matter, he had seen to it that all 4,109 names were cut afresh into a long bronze wall in the regiment's new memorial hall, where the families could come and reach up and lay a hand on a name and be answered. Eames goes on the day. He takes me sometimes. There is a Davin Eames cut into the bronze, third from the top of his column, set high so a boy would have to be lifted, and Eames puts his bare hand on it every time and says the same 3 words he said in the lantern light. Here. He's here. People ask me, when they hear the story, whether I regret breaking the silence, whether a guard who never spoke on watch in 19 years counts that one night a failure of his discipline. I tell them they have it backward, and I tell them why, because it is the truest thing I know about the trade I gave my life to. The silence was never the discipline. The silence was only ever the way I carried the discipline, the same as the stillness and the squared kit and the eyes held forward. The discipline itself was always the reason underneath, the keeping of a thing entrusted to me, held steady against everything the world threw at it until duty was satisfied. For 19 years that reason wore the shape of silence. For one night it wore the shape of 4,000 spoken names. I did not break my watch when I read them. I finished it. A man holds his post so that, at the 1 hour it truly matters, he can do the thing he was holding it for. That night the thing was the names, and I stood and I read them, and not one of those men passed into the dark unsaid. That is what we are for. That is the whole of it. The stillness is only the setup. The keeping is the watch.